Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. Today we're diving deep into one of the most unexpected, most politically explosive, and honestly, one of the most fascinating moments in American politics this year. The Oval Office meeting between President Donald Trump and New York City Mayor Mamdani. This wasn't just a handshake photo op. It wasn't just a polite political courtesy call. And it definitely wasn't just a local mayor visiting Washington. What happened around this meeting before, during, and after tells us something much bigger. It exposes the limits of New York City politics, the limits of progressive governance, the tension between federal and local power, and the reality check that hits when ideological promises collide with fiscal reality. And in today's video, I want to take you through why the meeting happened, what went down outside the White House before they even stepped inside, the political, ideological, and financial contradictions behind it, what Trump wanted, what Mamdani needed, and why this could mark the symbolic end of New York's experiment with city-level socialism before it even started. So buckle up, this one's big. Before Mayor Mamdani even stepped into the White House, something happened that set the tone for the entire day. On the way to D.C., as he walked to the White House for this high-profile meeting, he was confronted by independent journalist and activist Laura Loomer. Right there, on camera, Loomer asked him a very simple, very direct question. Do you condemn your supporters attacking a Jewish synagogue in New York last night? This was referring to a widely discussed incident in New York where some of Mamdani's supporters were involved in an altercation outside a synagogue. It instantly became a political firestorm, especially considering the broader national climate around antisemitism. Now, how did Mamdani respond? He didn't condemn the attack. He didn't address it. He didn't even acknowledge the concern. Instead, he shifted the conversation entirely and said the issue his supporters cared most about was affordability, housing, cost of living, and everyday economic struggles. That response raised eyebrows, especially because New York's current mayor, Eric Adams, immediately condemned the attack the night it happened and announced he would personally visit the synagogue to show support for the Jewish community. So before Mamdani even reached the White House doors, he was already carrying a political liability. But that wasn't going to be the biggest problem of his day. After the meeting ended, both Trump and Mamdani appeared in the Oval Office to speak briefly with reporters, and surprisingly, both of them struck an extremely respectful tone. Trump said, "The better he does, the happier I am." Mamdani said he looked forward to working with the president to bring real results for New Yorkers, especially on housing affordability. On camera, smooth, civil, upbeat, but underneath that polite tone was a very real contradiction. These two men couldn't be further apart, ideologically, politically, or personally, for the past year. Mamdani repeatedly attacked Trump's immigration policies. He accused the federal government of failing immigrants. He pushed socialist-style policies, free public transit, rent freezes, universal childcare, massive housing subsidies. And Trump criticized Mamdani's ideology, called it communistic, and said it had no place in America. These two men weren't just political opponents, they were ideological opposites. So why the sudden civility? Because Mamdani needed something big, something only the federal government and only Trump could give him. We'll get to that. But first, we need to talk about the promises Mamdani made to win office. Because those promises are the reason he had no choice but to show up in the Oval Office. During his campaign, Mamdani made a sweeping series of bold promises, many of them inspired by democratic socialist platforms. He promised free public transit, affordable housing for all, a rent freeze, reduced childcare costs, major expansions in social spending. Promises that on paper sound great. Promises that resonate with a lot of New Yorkers who are overwhelmed by high costs. But there was one enormous problem. None of these promises came with realistic funding sources. Let me break this down in a straightforward way for everyone watching. In the United States, tax authority is divided into federal taxes, state taxes, local taxes. Cities like New York don't have unlimited power to raise new revenue. In fact, they're extremely restricted. Local taxes, mostly property taxes, and those funds overwhelmingly go to public schools, legally. You can't take school funding and spend it on transit, housing subsidies, or childcare programs. Federal taxes, a city mayor has no authority over federal tax policy. State taxes, this would be the only possible source of new funding. But here's the problem. New York's Governor, Kathy Hochul, has already made it clear she will not raise state taxes, which means no new revenue on corporations, no new revenue on wealthy individuals, no new progressive tax expansions. In other words, Mamdani's entire economic platform was built on money he doesn't have and legally cannot obtain. And even if he tried, rich New Yorkers and major employers can and do leave. Texas and Florida are right there offering no state income tax, lower cost of doing business, more predictable regulatory environments. Voters can leave with their feet. Capitals can leave with their wallets. And New York knows this. So here's the truth. Mamdani didn't say publicly, but became very clear after he took office. New York City cannot fund the socialist reforms Mamdani campaigned on. Not legally, not politically, not economically. So what do you do when you promise the impossible? You go to Washington. You ask for federal money. And that takes us right back to the Oval Office. Mamdani didn't come to the White House to change Trump's ideology. He didn't come to negotiate immigration philosophy. He didn't come to build some unity coalition between a socialist mayor and a conservative president. He came because he needed cash, plain and simple. And here's the key moment that proves it. On the very first day of the government shutdown, the White House froze $18 billion in federal funding for two major New York infrastructure projects. The Gateway Tunnel under the Hudson River, the 2nd Avenue subway extension. These are not minor projects. These are some of the most expensive, ambitious pieces of infrastructure in America. And without federal money, they stall. For Mamdani, this freeze wasn't just a policy dispute, it was leverage. Trump held the upper hand, and Mamdani knew it. Because if he couldn't get federal help with infrastructure funding, then there was zero chance he would get federal help with any part of his affordability agenda. So in the Oval Office, Mamdani's real message was, New York can't do this alone. We need federal support. That right there, that moment, is the symbolic end of New York's socialist experiment. Not because Mamdani admitted failure, but because by asking the federal government for help, he confirmed that his platform cannot work without capitalist federal support, which is the opposite of the self-sufficient socialist model his campaign promised. Trump played the meeting smartly. In front of cameras, he was gracious. He called the meeting productive. He praised Mamdani's willingness to talk. He emphasized wanting New York to succeed. He offered small concessions like asking power companies to lower electricity bills. This last point is interesting. Electricity is only a small slice of New York's cost of living. Even if electric bills drop, rent stays sky high. Housing costs are the real crisis. But Trump didn't promise rent subsidies. He didn't promise socialist programs. He didn't promise free transit or universal child care. He offered what he could within federal policy, energy cost reductions, tied to his broader national energy agenda. He was signaling, I'll help where it makes sense, but I'm not funding a socialist wish list. It was smart politics. He gave Mamdani just enough to claim progress, but not enough to validate Mamdani's ideology. Meanwhile, Trump had his own priorities, and the biggest one, immigration enforcement. One of the longest segments of the meeting, according to insiders, involved immigration, specifically cooperation with ICE. Historically, Mamdani signaled opposition to cooperating with federal immigration enforcement. He wanted New York to be a sanctuary city in the fullest sense. But Trump was clear. If we catch known murderers, drug traffickers, and other dangerous individuals, we need your cooperation to remove them. This wasn't optional. This wasn't symbolic. This was a core Trump agenda item. And here's the interesting part. After the meeting, Trump said he believed they could work something out. That implies Mamdani made private concessions, or at least opened the door to them. Why? Because he needed federal help. And Trump wasn't going to give help without leverage. Immigration cooperation was the leverage. This is politics at its most basic form. You want money? You give something in return. We don't know the exact details, not yet, but the tone suggests some level of flexibility that Mamdani publicly refused before. That's a major shift. Remember the confrontation earlier with Laura Loomer? While that issue didn't stay outside the White House, Trump reportedly raised concerns about rising antisemitism in New York and the previous night's synagogue incident. And Mamdani responded by saying he was committed to combating antisemitism across all 5 boroughs. Some will see this as a positive pledge. Some will be skeptical given his previous silence. But the political reality is, he had no choice but to address it. This wasn't a minor local incident anymore. It had become part of national political discourse, and Trump wasn't going to ignore it. Let's step back and examine something crucial. Even if Mamdani wanted to pursue a bold international human rights agenda, like endorsing the International Criminal Court or threatening to detain foreign leaders such as Benjamin Netanyahu, he legally can't. Foreign policy is exclusively federal. Cities can't join international courts, enforce international warrants, detain foreign heads of state. Those powers belong to the U.S. federal government and no one else. So when Mamdani made symbolic promises involving international law and foreign leaders, they were never real. They were political theater, and in Washington, the illusion collapses. Almost unbelievably, just hours before the Trump-Mamdani meeting, the U.S. House of Representatives passed a resolution condemning the horrors of socialism. The vote, 285 in favor, 98 opposed, 86 Democrats joined Republicans. That's not a Republican message. That's a bipartisan message. When House Speaker Mike Johnson commented on the meeting, he even said it was a fitting coincidence that Congress voted to condemn socialism on the same day a self-identified socialist mayor met with Trump to request federal support. Symbolism matters in politics, and this symbolism was loud. The country is not moving towards socialism. It is moving away from it. When you look at the entire picture, the promises, the fiscal realities, the legal limitations, the political pressures, the confrontation with federal power, it becomes clear New York City's flirtation with socialist municipal governance hit a wall the moment its mayor had to ask the federal government for capitalist funding. Socialism, by definition, requires independent fiscal power, control over revenue, control over economic redistribution, control over social spending priorities. New York City has none of these. It is a creature of federal law, state taxation, federal funding, federal immigration enforcement, federal international policy. So when Mamdani walked into the Oval Office to request federal assistance, he acknowledged, indirectly but unmistakably, that New York cannot fund or implement a socialist agenda independently. It wasn't a public admission, but it was a structural one. An admission baked into the very act of seeking federal help. That's the big question. Here's what I think we'll see. 1. Mamdani will soften certain positions, particularly around immigration enforcement and cooperation with ICE. 2. Trump will offer limited, targeted help, likely around energy costs or infrastructure, but not socialist programs. 3. The ideological divide will remain. This meeting didn't reduce philosophical differences, it just put them on pause. 4. The political narrative will shift. Trump can say, even New York's socialist mayor needed federal support. Mamdani can say, I went to Washington to fight for affordability. Both win something, neither wins everything. 5. The socialist platform in New York will lose steam, not because of politics, but because of math. You can't implement massive redistribution without massive revenue. You can't raise massive revenue without state approval. And you can't get state approval when the governor already said no. The Trump-Mamdani Oval Office meeting wasn't a reconciliation. It wasn't a turning point for national unity. It wasn't a moment of ideological breakthrough. It was a collision between political idealism and institutional reality. It showed the limits of municipal socialism, the leverage of federal power, the consequences of campaign promises built on unfunded mandates, the tension between symbolic politics and real governance, and the unavoidable fact that every mayor, socialist or not, eventually has to deal with Washington. For Mamdani, the meeting was a necessity. For Trump, it was an opportunity. For New York, it was a reality check. And for the rest of the country, it was a glimpse into the future clash between ideology and practicality. New York's socialist project didn't die in a political battle. It died in a spreadsheet, long before anyone walked into the Oval Office. Thanks for watching. If you found this deep dive helpful, make sure to like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. I always read your thoughts, especially when the topic is this big. See you in the next one.